Health bars, chokeholds, and getting knocked out. Here are 11 lies games tell us about fighting. Sure, there are lots of things fighting games do that obviously don't work, though if you've never even tried doing a dragon punch, you obviously haven't played them enough. But there are subtler, less obvious fibs that even the most realistic games tell you about fighting, and for your sake, you should probably learn about them before you try to rage combo anyone for real. In this video, we've consulted real-life MMA practitioner, Brazilian jiu-jitsu brown belt, and Ryu enthusiast Joel Snape to sort the Hadoukens from the Hadon't-kens, yes, and hopefully leave you a little bit better informed about how to survive a violent confrontation IRL. Pro tip, it almost always involves running away. In games, chokeholds are the non-lethal equivalent of a silenced shot to the dome. Easy, effective, and almost instantaneous. They'll knock anyone out for long enough to shove them into a locker and take over their nuclear facility, after you've stolen their trousers. And while bits of that are sort of accurate, it unfortunately isn't quite as easy as it sounds. Here's why.
So the main difference between chokeholds in video games and chokeholds in real life is that the latter just don't last very long. So technically, a chokehold is anything that cuts off the blood supply to your brain via your carotid arteries, whereas a strangle is anything that cuts off your air supply via your trachea. Strangles actually take quite a long time to go on. It might take like 30 seconds or a minute, whereas a blood choke, because the blood's immediately going away from your brain, can go on in as little as 5 seconds. So you can actually knock people out very quickly. The flip side is that as soon as the blood starts going back to your brain, you wake up immediately. In a scenario like Metal Gear Solid or Hitman, you certainly wouldn't have enough time after you choked someone out to steal his trousers or throw him in a cupboard.
If you've seen enough UFC fights, you'll know that fighters tend to be up and about just a few seconds after being choked completely unconscious, none the worse for wear. And nobody ever stays on the floor for long enough to have even their shorts stolen. But there's more to it than that.
The flip side is that it's actually very possible to kill someone with a chokehold if you don't know what you're doing, which is why referees in the UFC are very quick to break them up, and also why there have been a couple of tragic real-life cases where people have applied them not knowing what they're doing and with horrible consequences. The other thing to understand about it, though, is that you can't actually snap someone's neck from that back position, which you'll see in Metal Gear Solid sometimes. So the real takeaway point here is you can choke someone out, especially if you take them by surprise. It's really easy, but you'd still better have a backup plan for when they wake up while you're dragging them towards a meat locker.
In basically any 2D fighting game, you can be knocked out once a fight and go on to win the World Warrior title, or certainly stagger back to your feet in time to finish a best of 3. But that's fine, right? Everyone knows boxers are allowed to get straight back up if they can manage it before a 10 count. Unfortunately, real-life concussions come with some serious repercussions.
So when you get knocked out, that's basically you being hit hard enough that your brain kind of rattles around and slams into the side of your skull. There's a little bit of scientific debate over what actually causes the damage and you to fall over. Some scientists used to think it was just to do with bruising on the outside of your brain. There's now a kind of other movement that thinks it's about fibers inside your brain being pulled apart by the motion. But the important thing is that it's quite difficult to recover from, and certainly not something you want to do several times over the long term. Most MMA organisations have rules that if you've been knocked out, you can't even spar for 60 days afterwards because the progressive effects of multiple knockouts are so unpleasant. And there's even evidence that even little micro concussions, like the ones that you might get from banging your head against the headboard or slamming your heads together during an NFL game, are enough to give you horrible cumulative effects over the long term.
So it's not ideal for Guile to be racking up the KO losses, even if he's winning every fight. But even with a couple of months off between every fight, there's still long-term damage to worry about.
So without wanting to be too depressing about it, there's increasing evidence that being knocked out several times over the course of your career is really bad for you. And there's actually been studies done on NFL players that suggest that even very young guys can have dementia-like effects from repeated trauma to their head over a long career. So in the long term, even though it might not seem like it at the time, it's actually a lot more productive to root for a UFC fighter to lose by having his arm or his leg broken than by being knocked unconscious.
Most fighting games suggest we have an internal energy bar. As long as there's still some health left, you'll probably be fine. Games like Street Fighter teach us that every kick in the shins, punch to the liver, or fireball in the nuts takes points off one's central energy bar, that when depleted signals a KO. This is obviously ridiculous, but why?
Cumulative damage matters a little bit, but probably not as much as you'd think. You can get punched in the face like 100 times, as long as you see it coming and you can brace for the impact. But the first time you take a shot that you're not expecting, don't be surprised if you go down like a crumpled crisp packet. You can help this stuff by working your neck to be more muscular, which a lot of boxers do. But what you'll often see in fights is that guys will be throwing a punch and then they'll suddenly be knocked out by one that they didn't see coming because they weren't prepared for it. And actually the liver shot is even worse, because what it does is, your liver is actually a very important organ, but because it's grown larger over the years, as it increases in complexity, I'm talking millions of years here, it's become it's grown outside of your rib cage and got more vulnerable. And now, getting hit really hard in it causes all of your blood vessels to spontaneously dilate at the same time, which just takes your legs out from underneath you and is incredibly painful, as you'll know if it's ever happened to you. I genuinely have been hit in the liver really hard once, and it's like, you just go, and then you just go, and just, like, there's no fight in it. You can't, like, you can get hit in the face and go, oh yeah, fine, whatever. But you get hit in the liver and you're like, no, I'm done.
The flip side is that it's actually a good idea to go back to someone's body or legs, aiming to slow them down throughout a fight or ruin their cardio by punching them in the lungs. But you're never going to see someone take a whole bunch of punches only to be taken out for good by a blocked shot to the big toe. In games, a bit of knifey punchy is still essentially a fair fight. At worst, taking a stab wound to the gut might take off a bit more energy than being punched in the same spot, but it's certainly not going to end the fight instantly. And if you block, totally fine.
So in real life, going up against a man with a knife is almost certainly going to end terribly for you, even if you win. The first thing to understand about knife fighting is that having an actual live shiny blade in front of you is going to focus your attention in the worst possible way and probably immediately make any training you've done in the past go straight out of your head. The second thing to understand is that if you're wrestling for a knife, the man with the handle is almost certainly going to win, and there's almost no way that you can get away from him without getting yourself a little bit stabbed up. So self-defense courses quite often teach this principle by doing a drill with marker pens, where they'll dress someone in old clothes, give their opponent a marker pen and challenge them to wrestle for control of it. What you'll tend to find afterwards is that even if it seems like you've come away unscathed, you've been drawn on all over. And in real life, that would indicate quite a lot of blood loss. This actually happened in a situation with me. My friend was wrestling for control of a marker pen that I had. He managed to get me in a Kimura, but it emerged afterwards that I'd done one perfect ink spot right on his trachea.
So what should you do if you actually do end up getting attacked by a knife-wielding maniac? Well, opinions differ. Some people think you should try and grab the knife out of the guy's hands, while others suggest that you should just try and punch him in the face and hope for the best.
But the biggest problem with knife fights in real life is that you're probably not even going to realise that they're happening until you're already in one. If someone shows you the knife they're planning to stab you with, you're actually quite lucky. They're much more likely to do what's sometimes known as a sewing machine attack, which is fairly self-explanatory, and things get a bit more Assassin's Creed than they do Soul Calibur. So if you're in a situation where you think there might be knives about, the best advice is probably to get out of it pronto.
This one applies to Hollywood too. All the most effective moves involve you leaping through the air in an incredibly telegraphed ballet of spinning destruction. But just as it's the punch you don't see that gets you, the through the air twirl is the move least likely to do any damage.
Kind of a problem with making games about fighting is that the most effective moves in real life fighting don't actually look that cool. The whole point of real life fighting is to do something that your opponent, who's probably quite well trained in doing this stuff, isn't going to see coming, let alone like the crowd or anybody who might be watching. So what you're really aiming to do is like a very short, nice jab, a quick low kick, or a little snappy elbow that he's not even going to realise is happening. Kind of the opposite is true in games. You're trying to do flashy stuff that looks good, and certainly in the older school games, you couldn't have those tiny little glitches in animation that would make a really short jab actually look nice or land in a convincing way.
But as ever, there's an important exception to the rule.
So the exception to that rule, though, is that in modern mixed martial arts, where everybody knows the basics of what a Muay Thai kick or a boxing straight right hand looks like, there is actually a bit of leeway to do some flashy kicks and have them land. because they're the things that nobody's expecting. A guy called Anthony Pettis has thrown more than one Albertido, which if you've seen Tekken, you'll know is a move that looks ridiculously implausible and more like breakdancing than anything that would happen in a real fight. A guy called Lyoto Machida's thrown a kick that looks more like the crane kick from Karate Kid than anything else, purely because he's so gifted at misdirecting people with his hand movements and his feet that nobody really knows what to expect from him next. So yes, flashy moves do have a place, but it's always better to focus on basics first.
Hired goons in games tend to be very polite. Yes, ultimately they're always trying to crack you over the head with a chair, but at least they have the decency to take turns doing it. It's very rare that you'll be caught in a massive pile-on, which, as you know if you've done any fighting at school, is usually the way it goes.
So the idea that everybody will form an orderly queue to attack you comes kind of partly from Jean-Claude Van Damme films, and partly from the fact that it's the only fun way to organise a fight in a video game. When you see someone like Batman attacking a whole bunch of people, or Ezio from Assassin's Creed calmly dispatching guys one by one, it's just a lot more fun than watching someone get bundled by a huge group of people. In reality, you're very unlikely to be able to fight even 2 people at once, let alone a dozen, which is kind of important to remember. And it's certainly not a good idea to be trying to grapple one guy while his mates kick you in the head, which is something that quite often happens in the Batman games. That doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do any grappling, which is what a lot of self-defense instructors will tell you, because the better you are at grappling, the easier it is to stay on your feet and get away from a confrontation in the first place. And also, if you manage to suplex the first guy through a wall, there's much more chance that his mates will leave you alone.
Of course, combos aren't a thing. Sure, there are combinations of moves that work better than others to maximise the momentum of shifting your body from side to side, the classic jab cross hook combination for example. But there's no way to guarantee that a string of hits lands as long as the first one connects. Or is there?
So, okay, technically there's no such thing as a combo in real life. If you've got a really good trained fighter, it doesn't matter what you do to him, there's still a good chance that he'll be able to cover up, block, slip, deflect the next thing you do. There is one kind of tiny exception to this in real life street fighting though, and that's called the OODA loop, which stands for observe, orientate, decide and react. And it's something that you can disrupt with, let's say, a punch in the face. What it basically means is that when you see something new happening, you have to kind of see what's going on, then think about it a little bit before you can decide and react on what to do. If you can disrupt that by, say, breaking someone's nose, then it resets the whole process and they have to do the whole thing again. So if you can just keep hitting them with a little flurry punch, possibly they'll never get to the reaction part and you'll win with nothing more than a set of bruised knuckles.
In games, the simple expedient of putting your arms in front of your face is often enough to stop any or all damage, which makes sense, because building evasion mechanics into a game is much trickier than having a one-size-fits-all button. But in real life, blocking isn't quite so simple.
So I actually believed as a child that if you just raised your forearms enough, or like did the old knee block that Sagat does, that would stop any and all damage. But unfortunately, as soon as you actually start doing any fighting, you realise that even getting punched in the forearms really, really hurts, especially if the guy's only wearing small gloves. It's actually even worse with kicks, because the only real way to block, say, a low kick in Muay Thai is to raise your own shin and make sure you have a shin-on-shin clash, which all that really does is make sure that the other guy gets hurt just as much as you do.
Sure, this one's a bit macabre, but it's important to understand. After all, games like Mortal Kombat make a massive deal of pulling someone's spine out or kicking them into the past, but actually killing people is simultaneously harder and much, much easier than you've been led to believe. Confused? Well, don't be. Here's Joel again.
Kind of one of the important things to remember about mixed martial arts is, though it's the closest you can get to a fight without actually turning into a gladiatorial bloodbath, there's still quite a lot of rules as to what you can't do, and most of those are taking out the things that are really, really lethal. For instance, I think there's like 42 rules in the UFC, and most of them are things like not being able to elbow somebody in the back of the head when they're trying to take you down, not being able to knee them in the top of the head while they're on their knees, or not being able to kick them in the head, which would be even worse, obviously, if they were wearing shoes. So It's actually surprisingly easy to kill someone in a real fight, even if you can't pull out their spine or set them on fire.
But the most lethal adversary in your typical street confrontation isn't a robot ninja or a tiny monster riding a much larger monster. It's a simple, inanimate object which you encounter every day. That's right, we're talking about the ground.
So the most important safety measure in most styles of professional fighting is that they take place on mats or canvas, which means that if you get thrown or suplexed or punched to the ground, then you're not immediately going to shatter your skull on the floor. And while it's quite easy to decide that you're not going to do that to somebody in a real life situation where all the floors are made of concrete, it's actually surprisingly easy to accidentally knock somebody out and watch them crack their head on a curb and then end up going to prison for manslaughter. Which, again, is another really good reason why you should never ever get in fights outside of nice organised contexts.
In games, it's only the comedy boxing characters who bother to protect their hands. Everyone else needs their fingers free for throat jabbing or intricate leg locks. But as Joel explains, there's a massive downside to going glove-free.
So one thing that you tend to see a lot in video games is characters wailing away on each other for minutes on end with completely bare and yet unbruised and unbloodied knuckles. In real life, even wearing the 4-ounce gloves that are in the UFC, or even full-size boxing gloves, isn't always enough to protect your hands from getting broken. And certainly if you punch someone on the top of the head with an ungloved fist, you're much more likely to end up in hospital than them.
This is probably the biggest fib games consistently tell, that every dust-up is a beautiful ballet of moves that never clash or get overly scrappy. As Joel explains, the real thing is very different.
So probably the biggest myth that fighting games propagate, and especially games where there's multiple opponents involved, is that fights can be quite picturesque with like a flurry of activity as one guy acrobatically takes out a bunch of bad guys.
In real life, there's one game that mimics fighting better than any other, and it's not one that you might expect.
What tends to happen in a real life fight is more like GTA's various brawl modes, in which a bunch of guys run around like a pack of mad animals, winging haymakers at each other and kicking anybody who ends up on the floor. Real life fighting, outside of nice organised situations, isn't big, hard or clever, so please don't do it.
So there you go, a stack of fibs that games have been telling us about fighting that might give you the wrong impression about how martial arts really work. Your key takeaway from all this? It's always best to avoid fights altogether. Please like this video if you've learned anything, and subscribe to Logitech G for more weekly features. Thanks for watching.